Anyone criticizing the European Union will bring up one specific point. A country that is part of the EU hands over a part of its sovereignty to those bureaucrats in Brussels. And while populists often use this argument, it is true. When a state joins the EU, it can no longer negotiate its own trade agreements, cannot make policies that hinder competition in the EU's internal market. And after adopting the euro, it can't control its own monetary policy. So why would any country, let alone 27 of them, decide to give up part of their sovereignty? And why are there others that are eager to do the same? There are clear economical or political advantages. But why are they not afraid that Brussels will just take over everything? The short answer, because the loss of sovereignty is limited by a careful balance between national and European interest. Or one could say, the EU maintains a careful balance between sovereignty and supranationalism. To discuss this balance, we will highlight three key principles of the EU: subsidiarity, proportionality, and constructive ambiguity. Together they help preserve this balance, so that EU membership remains an attractive trade-off. The principle of subsidiarity states that every policy must be executed at the appropriate level. In more normal language, things should only be done on the European level if the national level cannot do it, only on the national if the regional level cannot do it, and so on. Subsidiarity is a fundamental principle of EU law enshrined in Article 5 of the Treaty on European Union, TEU. If member states or national parliaments believe an EU policy could also be done on a lower level, they can formally evoke this principle before the Court of Justice of the EU. The court then assesses whether the policy in question has added value at the European level. This way, at least in theory, policies are always executed at the most effective level of organization, and member states remain in charge of the matters they can handle better than the EU. One instance when the EU breached the principle of subsidiarity is regarding cigarette advertisements. In 1998, the EU adopted a law banning tobacco advertisements EU-wide. Germany filed a lawsuit against the Commission, arguing that there was no need for this to be an EU-wide policy, since the goal is to reduce tobacco consumption, and member states would be perfectly capable of creating the policies to achieve this goal themselves. The court agreed with the German government, and the act was annulled. This also highlights the way most EU laws are implemented. Not through direct rules called regulations, but through goals called directives. The EU sets a common goal, but does not say how to achieve it. Member states then decide themselves what ways work best in their context. This approach is really useful when policies happen on multiple levels. Take the environment. The EU sets goals, like how clean rivers should be, but member states decide how to get there. Because pollution doesn't stop at borders, having shared European standards makes sure everyone plays by the same rules. Another example is mobile roaming charges. For a long time, using your mobile phone abroad was costly. To tackle this problem, one needs to deal with cross-border telecom services, making it nearly impossible for individual member states to fix. For that reason, member states delegated the responsibility for administering roaming charges to the EU. Since 2017, the EU abolished roaming charges altogether, allowing citizens to use their mobile data subscriptions from home across the EU without paying extra. Another cornerstone principle of union law is the principle of proportionality. It ensures that actions of EU institutions and member states do not exceed what is necessary to achieve objectives, basically serving as a safeguard against overreach. In other words, it makes sure no cannon is used to kill a mosquito. Like the principle of subsidiarity, it is enshrined in Article 5 of the Treaty on European Union. If member states, EU institutions, or even individuals think a policy goes too far, they can challenge it before the Court of Justice of the European Union. In practice, the principle is applied in court through a three-part test. First, a measure must be suitable to achieve its intended goal. Second, it must be necessary, meaning that no less restrictive alternative could achieve the same result. Third, it must be proportionate in the strict sense, requiring that the benefits of the measure outweigh its costs or negative effects. The Court of Justice frequently applies this principle when reviewing both EU legislation and national measures that restrict fundamental freedoms or rights. For instance, an older but interesting example is Schmidberger versus Austria. Austria allowed a demonstration that temporarily blocked a major trade route. Schmidberger, a transport company, argued it blocked free movement of goods, which is a fundamental EU right, and claimed damages from Austria. Although it did indeed block the free movement of goods, the court held that protecting the right to peaceful protest justified the interference. As you can see here, it's not a black and white decision. It requires balancing competing values under proportionality. Similarly, when the EU decided to suspend funding to Hungary based on corruption and rule of law issues, Hungary argued this was not proportionate and challenged the EU regulation. The court ruled it was proportionate and dismissed Hungary's case. Again, a complicated decision. The third principle is different in nature. Constructive ambiguity is not a legal rule, but a political strategy. Constructive ambiguity is the use of vague or imprecise language in negotiations or agreements to enable consensus among parties with conflicting interests. In the EU, this approach allows member states to find agreements without committing to specific details that could provoke disagreement, creating flexibility and room for compromise. For example, the EU's handling of the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue has relied on deliberately vague formulations. This is needed because of a long-standing dispute stemming from Kosovo's 2008 Declaration of Independence, which Serbia continues to reject. This enabled both countries to agree while preserving political support at home. As you might guess, using vague language can be very effective to get to agreements, but it also carries risks. There is a reason why lawyers are always so fickle with exact wordings. When texts are ambiguous, they may be interpreted differently, both by different people and over time. The Brussels Agreement between Serbia and Kosovo illustrates this challenge. Unclear terms initially allowed progress, but different interpretations later complicated enforcement and slowed normalization efforts. Despite its drawbacks, constructive ambiguity remains a valuable tool for the EU. It enables compromise on complex issues, helping the Union to navigate political tensions and diverse national interests. Success depends on the willingness of parties to act in good faith and on eventually clarifying ambiguous terms to ensure practical implementation. When managed carefully, constructive ambiguity can balance flexibility and consensus, supporting EU cohesion even in contentious policy areas. In conclusion, while EU membership requires countries to give up certain aspects of sovereignty, the Union has developed principles that maintain a balance between national and European interests. Subsidiarity ensures that decisions are taken at the most effective level, giving member states control over matters they can handle better themselves. Proportionality safeguards against overreach, making sure EU actions are necessary and their benefits outweigh any costs or negative effects. Finally, constructive ambiguity provides flexibility in negotiations, allowing diverse member states to reach agreements despite differing priorities. Together, these principles demonstrate how the EU manages to maintain the delicate balance between cooperation and sovereignty, making membership an attractive choice. It also raises another, more philosophical question. Does joining the EU really cost a country a part of its sovereignty? Or does it actually maintain a lot of its sovereignty it would have otherwise lost? Or, in other words, how much sovereignty does a small country have when it's standing alone against major powers like China or the US? That is a question for another video.